Like I said, this is going to be long. You still hanging in there? Need a cup of coffee, bathroom break? Go ahead and take it. So we've gone through all this so far, and we have not really concentrated on the port security configuration. The reason I did that is I wanted to show you a lot of the options, because with port security it's not so much the configuration, because the configuration is going to stem from your security policy. So you want to decide what you want to do and know some of those options as to what you can do with port security before you decide to implement it, and then once you decide to implement it, which options you're going to configure. That said, there's two big gotchas, and one of those gotchas is probably just more specific to me. It's one of those things that I tend to bone up quite a bit. We did touch on this basically in another slide, and we'll see this in a table coming up. Ports cannot be dynamic, and I don't have the time to go over what a dynamic port is. There are other lessons for that, but generally by default ports are dynamic. They are going to be running something called DTP, Dynamic Trunking Protocol, which allows ports to automatically create trunks. I'm not going to go into DTP too deeply, but basically if you go into configure port security, and again the command that turns on port security is simply switch port security. That's the first command that you have to put in there. If you get this command rejected, this port is a dynamic port. Basically that's telling you that the port is running DTP. And we do a show run interface, and we see that the switch port mode is dynamic, desirable. We don't need to get into that. That's beyond the scope of this lesson. But basically you're going to have to configure one of two things. If you're running an access port, which is basically going to an end user, then you can issue the switch port mode access. That takes us out of dynamic. It's no longer trying to negotiate trunking when you do this. It disables DTP, and then you can go ahead and put on your switch port security command. If you're going to be running switch port security on a trunk, and we're not going to go through that in this lesson, but know that you can do this, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to hard code those trunks, and the way you do that is you set an encapsulation mode. It's going to be .1q or ISL. In this case we're using .1q, and then you have to set the switch port mode to trunk. When I put switch here, it's just a shortcut for switch port. Sorry if that throws you off. Then you can put your switch port security command on. So keep this in mind when you're configuring this, because if you run into this, you're going to be like, what the hell are they even talking about? And just know that you have to turn off DTP. The other way you can do that on a access port, and I don't know if this is based on iOS version, so don't take this as gospel. You can type in switch port space host, and that's actually going to throw on some Cisco best practices for an access port. It's going to enable spanning tree port fast, and I can't remember what the other thing is, and then set the switch port mode to access. We'll see that on the CLI. Anywho, moving on. And this one is a gotcha for me. You can put this down as Packet Labs gotcha. There's a couple things that I screw up all the time. This is one of them, because Cisco iOS will allow you to configure the port security options. And with a lot of features, once you configure an option, iOS is smart enough to say, well, obviously he wants to enable this feature. In this case, you have to explicitly configure switch port security, enter, get that in the configuration, and then start configuring your options. So in this case, you can see I've configured a grip of options here, and I'm like, all right, I've got port security running on my port. Well, what happens when that fifth MAC address comes in there? Nothing. Your aging time is not going to work. Your violation mode, your sticky is not going to work, because if you go ahead and do the verification command, you can see the first thing is that this is disabled. This will remain disabled until you type switch port security, enter. So keep that in mind. That's a big gotcha for me. May not be the same type of gotcha for you, but it won't give you a warning. It won't say, hello, I see that you are trying to configure port security. Perhaps you would like to enable this with the switch port security command. It doesn't do that for you. Okay, we saw this earlier. I have moved it to its rightful spot. I'm not going to discuss this again. We will see in the next slide a brief table that breaks this down for us. Okay, and here is that table. And again, this is good fodder for an exam. What I would do is I would memorize the ones that are no's, and just the rest are defaulted to yes. So our basic rule is that we can't configure port security on a dynamic port, which means DTP. So a DTP port, nope, can't do it. Dynamic access port, nope, can't do that. That's still DTP. This is good to know. A routed port, can't do it. And that makes sense because you're doing layer 3 at that point. Span destination, know that you cannot do it for destination port, but you can do it for a source port, which makes sense because a source port a lot of times is just going to be one of your access ports. Ether channel, nope, don't even try it. And then the rest of these, like I said, for the exam, go ahead and commit these to memory, but just know that these are all yays. And this slide is straight out of the Cisco documentation. It's good to go ahead and review this. This is to set the port security settings back to their default values. Most of these are pretty logical. If you want to set the maximum number of MAC addresses back to the default, just go ahead and enter the no switch port security maximum and then the value, and that will set it back to the default, which is 1. This one's interesting because this will set it to the default. I will check this out on the CLI. Remember that we had that one little caveat that if you have it set to, like, say for instance 3 and you set it to 4, not a big deal. I'll go ahead and increment that. If you have it set to 3 and then you try to set it back to 2, it's going to give you an error. So I don't know if it'll give you an error in this case. I wouldn't think so. I think that this would just be defaulting it, so that should be copacetic. This one, to disable sticky, I guess, you know, this makes sense too, because the default is dynamic secure addresses. So if you disable sticky, you're going to go to the default, which is dynamic secure addresses. The rest of these are part of another slide where we'll go over clearing this, but you can clear the port security database, for lack of a better word, from privilege exec mode with this command. Okay, stick with me guys, we're in the home stretch. For real, we're in the home stretch. Here's the port security verification commands. We've seen this guy quite a bit, the show port security, and then we specify an interface. You can go ahead and just hit enter after show port security and it will give you different output actually, and I'm not going to go through the rest of these because we do have slides for each of them in action. So this is the output if you specify show port security and then don't specify an interface. It will give you a list of all of the ports. In this case I only have it configured on one port. Probably would have been a better example if I would have had it on a couple more ports, but it gives you a quick snapshot on a per port basis. Doesn't give you as much detail as the next command that we'll show and we've already seen, but it tells you what the maximum amount of MAC addresses allowed is, how many are currently on that port, and by on that port I mean in the list of secure MAC addresses, how many violations have occurred on this port, and then what the violation mode is, and it's got the default of shutdown. This is pretty cool because it shows you the maximum limit for the system, excluding 1 MAC per port. So this is a 3550. You can see that it can learn approximately 5100 MAC addresses. So with port security enabled on all our ports and limiting the number to 10, we're not going to get anywhere near this limit and invoke the cam table flooding attack that we were talking about before. If we don't have port security setting the maximum number of secure MAC addresses per port, then you could get on a port and just fill this guy up. If once you hit that 5100 and whatever X, you have to figure in these MAC addresses, then it's going to turn your switch into a hub. Okay, and we've seen this guy quite a few times. This is the show port security interface, then specify an interface. This is really a good command. I mean, know this one for sure because this gives you more detail. It tells you if it's enabled, the port status, the violation mode. You can read these. You don't need me to read these for you. And we've gone through most of these, but this is really where you get the nuts and bolts of what's configured on your switch. So this one I would use more often than just show port security. Show port security is going to give you an overview of the entire switch, whereas this will get you down to the nitty gritty on a port by port basis. Okay, and remember how earlier I told you there's really no way to determine what type of method is being has been configured on a port to discover the secure MAC addresses? I lied to you. Not the first time, not going to be the last time. I don't use this command that often, so I forgot that this was a method to figure out how a MAC address was learned. So this is a show port security interface, and then you can specify the interface, hit address, and then just hit enter. And what that's going to do is it's going to show you all the MAC addresses that are in that table of secure MAC addresses on that port, which is very cool because it will show you the aging. It shows you the method that it was used to discover this, whether it's dynamic, secure sticky, or static. Shows you the MAC address, shows the total number of MAC addresses. It does not show the maximum. That would have been pretty interesting to have in there, but you can use this in conjunction with the other commands to see what's going on the port. This is a really good command. I should use this more. And this last command will show you a per VLAN view of port security on a specific interface. You'd most likely use this with a trunk rather than an access switch port. So here's the output. I don't know that I would use this too much. What's interesting is that you can set a default maximum per VLAN, and you can see here it's not set, so it's going to use all of the available MAC addresses for the switch. That might be something you want to set. Other than that, I don't see this being too handy unless you're one of those guys that's going to run this on a trunk